Hi guys, welcome to the third tutorial in our series Blender for Production. My name is Helge from pixeltrain. After you have seen in the first two tutorials how we can use the compositing workflow inside of Blender, we now want to start talking about the render process and how you prepare rendering for compositing. In this tutorial, we want to talk about scene organization for rendering. So we will take an intensive look into collections, which are really important for that. Then we talk about render layers, or like they are named inside of Blender ViewLayers. And we also want to take a look into render stats. So let's get started. We start with collections, and I know many Blender users think, oh, collections are something like a group, so fast forward the video. But these collections are extremely important, so maybe it's a good idea to watch this briefly to understand how collections really work and what you can do with them. So what is a collection? If you take a look here into your outliner, you see that we have two collections here, a scene collection and the collection with a nice name, collection here. And if you want to organize your scene into different chunks, you can use a collection. So let's do that here really briefly. I say, for example, I want to have these two guys here, so I'll select both, and I want to have a new collection for them. You can use for this a keyboard shortcut, which is M, or you can go here to Object. There's a collection submenu, and here is Move to Collection M. What we now do is we press M, and you see we get a little pop-up. In the header of the pop-up, you see that this here is Move to Collection. Then we have the option to create a new collection, and we have a list of all the collections which you have in your scene. So the scene collection and the collection with the name collection. So what we want is a new collection here. I name this collection, let's say Objects. And after clicking OK, you see here on the left in your mini HUD that you can rename a collection if you have forgotten to give it a name. Yeah, and here is your collection. So this is one way of making a collection. Move directly into a new collection. But there are different ways of doing that. You also have this little button here for creating a collection. And this button here is a really interesting one, because if you select another collection, for example, this collection here, and you click this button, you see you get a sub-collection here. If you don't want that, you can take a collection and drag it out into a new hierarchy. For example, here to Objects or into the Scene collection. Now we have a new collection. Let's name this Environment, for example. And now we can take this ramp here and the floor, press the M key, and now we have this list here, and we move them into the environment here. So the things here is also something which we want to bring into a collection. For example, the area light and the top light. So select these two guys here, and then M key again, new collection, and we say this is lights. And the camera here I want to have on this scene collection level, and this collection we don't need, so you can use the X key on your keyboard to get rid of that. So now we have our hierarchy, for example, for working in a complex scene. Like I've said, you can have more than one collection stacked in each other, so you can have this really deep. For rendering purposes, we want to have a flat hierarchy for the render layers later. So you can have sub-collections here, that's no problem, but what we later address inside of our render layers are these top collections here. And there's a little keyboard trick here inside of Blender. So if you press the N key here on your keyboard and you take a look here through the view menu here, you see that there's a subsection for collections here. And if you open that up, you see that we have here a list of the collections, but only the top collections. So that's the interesting thing, the top collections are special. And another thing is here really interesting. If you hover with your mouse over these here, you see there's an automatic assigned shortcut for every of these collections. Shortcut 3, 2, and 1. Which means if you go here over the viewport and press the 1 key on your keyboard, you see only the elements which are part of the first collection, which is Objects. Number 2 is the environment. Number 3 are the light sources. If you want to have a combination, for example, Objects and light sources, you can press the 1 key first for the Objects, Shift key 3, And so now we have these two collections now active. A really useful concept if you later work in rigging, for example, or so. So the top collections, like I've said, are important for something which you can do here. So let's get rid of the end menu. You can also make these visibility tricks here inside of this outliner. So this eye symbol here tells you what is visible, what is not visible. And you also can hold down your left mouse button and drag here over the eyes to have this a little bit faster. Also, you can solo collections by control clicking here. Go over the eye and control click here onto the collection which you want to solo out. On my Mac, only control works, not the command key. Okay for me. Now we have learned how a simple collection works. But there's more. What if you need later for rendering purposes a collection setup which is a little bit more complicated? I want to have, for example, also a collection with all the objects which are part of the dynamics. Now we run into a problem because this ramp here is part of environment and the dynamic objects are here under objects. So two different collections. And it seems that every object can only be part of one collection, but this isn't true. Let's take a closer look into the keyboard shortcuts. If you go to Object, Collections here, you see that Move to Collection was M, but there's also another collection menu item which is Shift M, Link to Collection. Maybe you know that Blender internally has a node system, and so you can link objects to more than one other node. And that's exactly the thing we do now. So what we do now is we select all these dynamic objects here and press now Shift M instead of M. And you see the header has now changed. Link to collection is now the header. And now we can make a new collection here with the name, for example, Dynamics. And we click OK. And now you see we have another collection here with the name Dynamics. All the objects are in. And here are the same objects because you link them now. So there is no real object here or here. Both are the same. It's only a linking structure which you have. So what you can do in complex scenes is you can have different kind of sorting ideas, how you want to sort and address a scene like this here. So now we've done this. If you want to know more about collections, there are really great tutorials and also the help file. We can see that you can instantiate collections, which is a really powerful technique inside of Blender. But this was the basics we need for our rendering. So let's talk now a little bit more about these collections here. And what I want to show you is a workflow where you can split your outliner. So let's do that first. I want to have two outliners here. So I go here into this area here and I drag a new area up so that we have now two outliners open at the same time. And you see you can work in both of them at the same time. So let's change what the outliner shows you. There are different ways of configure your outliner. One is this menu here. You see, if you go into this menu here, you normally see here the ViewLayers, but you also can look into other things here. So this is a really interesting concept if you want to dig deeper inside of Blender. But what you also have is a filter area here, and this filter area is a really powerful area. The first thing I want to demonstrate to you is what you see with the filters. And here you see you can get rid of stuff. What I want to see in this outliner here, for example, are always the collections. So this is okay now. But here in this area here, I don't want to see the collections at all. So you go here and say, don't show me the collections. And I am back now in the object world. And a little side note at this point is if you have, for example, now a new collection here, it's only for demonstration purposes, and you now take an object here, for example, the floor, and you drag it into this collection here, what you get now is a link. You see the floor is still part of environment and still part of, I don't know, yeah, dynamics maybe or whatever. So if you have deactivated the collections here, you don't drag them out of the collection and you automatically get this linking function which we had before. But I go back now here, I don't need this collection at all. It's only now here a helper. So this is a setup which you maybe want to use with these two guys here. But in our case, we now want to talk about what we can do with visibilities in rendering processes and so on. So let's get rid again of this outliner here. It was only for demonstrating this. And you normally see only the eye here, which means the visibility in the viewport. So if we now open a render window, let's do that fast here. What I do now is I open up an image editor here. Render result is active here, otherwise select this. And if you now want to render without having a floating window, you remember if you click here render, you always get a floating window here, and this here is an image viewer. What you can do is, I stop this with escape, you can go into the preference of Blender, go to, I think it's interface, and under editors here, there's a temporary windows area. Open this, and here you say render in, not a new window, but in an existing image editor. So if you have an image editor open, it uses this image editor. Otherwise, it creates one. Or you also can say never open a window. And if there's no image editor, keep the user interface. You always can open the last renderer in an image editor or under renderer, here view render. But what I do for my case is I tell now the system, okay, I want to use an existing image editor. And if you do that now, and I save this scene really fast here so that I don't lose our work. Okay. We now can go here with F12 or render image, and you also see here on the left side the render. So we don't have to wait forever for a pop-up window here. So now let's take a closer look to the flags here. The eye flag is only visibility inside of the viewport. And one thing which you now have to keep in mind is you remember that under dynamics and under objects, we have bluish and reddish. So what you now see is that if I deactivate objects here, you will see that normally bluish and reddish will vanish, but they don't vanish. Why? Because the collection dynamics is still active and visible, and bluish and reddish are parts of this collection. So you see them. If you don't want to have that, deactivate dynamics here. And now you see it works like expected. So if you have prepared something like that here for rendering purposes, you can say, okay, I deactivate everything which I don't want to see here. So untick this, or you can name them. So in some bigger scenes, I named them, for example, when I know that I want to use them only as render layers, for example, RL_dynamics. And I later then only use the RL elements, but not the rest here. So this is an idea which you maybe can use in your practice. But this visibility here now is only the viewport. So if I now render this here again, you still see here that the objects are active. Also, keep in mind, if you go here now to the cycles renderer, this here is the viewport representation. So it's cycles, yes, but it's viewport. It's not rendering. So what if you want to get rid here of these objects also in the render process? What you can do here is you open here new columns inside of the outliner. And if you click here, you see we have here toggles. And only two toggles are active. Here this little tick for the view layer visibility, and here the eye. This is really useful if you have complex scenes, so it's for selecting objects. So if you remove selectable, they can't be selected anymore. Useful. And then we have the visibility in the viewport, visibility in the rendering. Then we have the hold out option, and we have the indirect option, and I activate everything. So now we have a little bit more complex setup here. And now we can go here to the objects and say we don't want to see them in the viewport, but or better go here to the viewport itself. Don't in the viewport, and also not in the rendering. And now we can render here, and you see the objects are gone now. So that's a way of removing objects from a view layer or from the rendering at the moment. So Now we have learned these here. What you also can do here is, like I've said, you can generate a so-named holdout. So let's make a holdout here and then render again. If you see now the rendering here, what a holdout is a black hole. You see the indirect stuff is still there, but here where normally the objects are, there's a hole in your plate. And that's exactly what you have if you need a holdout. So this is that option here. And now you maybe wonder, why have I told you so much about collections? If you open this up here and you try to find these options now here on the objects, you see you don't have them. So this is really important. This is on a collection base here at this point. And then we also have an option which is here the indirect only. So if you click this here and you make again a render, we'll see the objects are gone again. But you now see that on the floor here, you see the reflections of the objects which are not visible, and also the shadows. So this is the way of getting, for example, reflections of objects or shadows which you don't want to see in a pass. So and these are all the preparations we now need to make render layers. So let's get started with our render layers. Like I've said, render layers inside of Blender are named ViewLayers. And if you take a look here, you see we always work on one view layer with the name ViewLayer. So this is there forever. And you can now go in here and use this view layer here, for example, and rename it. So I click here in and I say, this is the view layer with a nice name, all, and that's it. And then we can have a new one. You see, if you go here to the list, you see we only have one view layer with the name all at the moment. So let's click here this duplicate again, and then we can now select, do you want to have a new one, a blank one, or you want to copy all the settings? I want to have a new one. Now it's named all 001, which is not what I want. So let's take now a layer where I only see these funny guys here. So let's say funny guys is the name of the layer. And what you now can do is we can now tell this layer here what is visible in rendering. How to do that? For this, we need collections. Again, you select the objects here and make a right mouse button click. And now you see, because you have selected a collection, it's a collection context menu, and that's the important thing. You see that there's a menu with the name ViewLayer, and here you have options now. Set as a holdout, set indirect only, we tested that before, and disable from the view layer, which is exactly what we not want to do. So for everything else, we now say, okay, I don't want to see the environment here, and I also don't want to see these dynamics here, which we had before, so select both of them, right mouse button click, view layer, disable from view layer, or you can use the keyboard shortcut E on your keyboard over the outliner, and that's it. And now you see they are now grayed out, you don't see anything anymore. And let's render now this layer. Interesting thing happens. You suddenly see everything, but wait until the rendering is done. You see, suddenly the rendering renders 2 times. What happened? If you have taken a closer look here in the upper part of the rendering, it was really fast, you maybe saw that you had a menu where you saw which render layer it renders at the moment. And you see, if you open now this drop down here, you see we have a composite, and we have a render layer with the name all, and we have a render layer with the funny guys. That was the reason why it rendered 2 times. It first rendered all, and then it rendered funny guys. And if you select now funny guys, you see that's the result of this render layer. Interesting. So now the rendering takes longer because we have 2 render layers going on here. And Blender will always render, if you click render now, both layers. And this is sometimes not so useful because you only want to test what's going on in this layer which I've selected here. To now tell this to the renderer, you can go here into the view layer properties. If you now select this, you see here on the view layer what you get as a result. And here you see we can switch the whole thing now to render a single layer. So if you do that here, you only render the layer which is active here. Let's test this again. Maybe I'll test this again. I think you will see the result instantly. So if you now render, you see only funny guys comes up. It renders really fast, and then you get your composite from before. So that's the way to set up the system for debugging purposes. So let's now look into what happens if I remove now the light from funny guys here. So we go here to light, and this time I use the keyboard shortcut. You remember from the right mouse button menu, view layer, it's a shortcut E. So if you press now E here and render this again, you will see, oh, we don't see anything here on funny guys. Why? Because you don't have a light source. So you always have to keep in mind what you need to produce the result what you have. If you want to go back here and to activate something else again, you see E was exclude from a layer, and enabling on this layer, it's Alt E, so the opposite again. So really simple here. So now if we render, we get back here the result from before. And what I now want to do in my scene here is I want to split this scene a little bit more. You see, I have a light source here and I have this ring. And what I want to do is I want to split the scene so that I have sometimes a render where I only have the light sources and sometimes where I have the ring. So let's do that together here. So I select now the ring here, and the ring should be in lights. So we need this time linking, not moving to collection. So Shift M, link to a collection, and what I say this here is emissive scene or emissive lights. I don't know if the name makes sense, but yeah, do it. And now we have emissive lights here, and in these lights here we have everything. So what we now want to do is another layer, this time this light. Shift M again, and we say this collection is now real lights. Okay, done. And now we can decide in our render path funny guys here, for example, what we want to see. I want that the emissive light here is in, but not the real lights. So first I have to deactivate this lights, which is everything. So keyboard shortcut E. Then I go here to the real lights, again, keyboard shortcut E. So we only have the emissive lights and the objects. Let's make a render here. And here we are. We only get, on funny guys, this result here. So now we can make a duplicate of this layer or a new one. Let's make a new one. And this is funny with lights. Okay, and now we only want to see the objects and the real lights. So all of this here, something we don't want to see. Real lights is on, environment is on, objects is on, and test this. Here we are. I hope this helps you to understand this system a little bit more. And if you now go to the compositing world, and you remember in our setups which we used to have that we have these render layers here, you remember also that we had this drop down here, and now this makes sense. So if you go here to funny guys, you see this result here. If you go to funny with lights, you see this result here. And if you want to have now a node tree where you mix stuff around, you can have more than one render layer node here. So you go here to input and make a new render layers node here and say, here we want to have this with this result here, and then we can start mixing the stuff around. So that's the idea here. Let's make a final setup here. So what I want to do is here, for example, a setup where I have only the floor and this here, so environment with, for example, shadows and reflections of the objects. So let's do that together to understand this. So what we need here is an environment path. environment, and then we first try everything what we need. So we don't want to see the objects, deactivate them, and you will see that is a mistake. Then, do we need the lights for the floor? Yeah, we want to have the lights, and we have the top light and the area lights, so we don't need the emissive light and the real light at this point, because lights is everything. And here, the guy's dynamics, we also don't need. So something like that here. Now we only have the floor, right? Let's test this. Looks good. We only get the floor. We are happy. But if you now take a closer look here on the floor, we see no shadow or reflections of our guys. And maybe you need later in Composite exactly that. So how to get around this problem now? For this, we have to reactivate Alt-E the objects again. But this time, we can use these flags here. So I make this with the right mouse button click. I click here the object layer, right mouse button click, go to the view layer, and this time we tell the system, I want to set these guys here to indirect only. So everything which is now here, bluish and reddish, are contributing the indirect rays, which are reflections, shadows, and so on. So you see, that's this flag here. Now we can render the whole thing again. And now you see, that's exactly what we want at this point here. So I hope this helps you to understand your setup. Later, if you are working, you deactivate that here. So every render process always renders everything which is here in this list, which is a really nice feature. And then inside of the compositor here, you can then use every of these render layers and mix them. Typical example would be foreground, background, midground, whatever you need to do. So last thing I want to show you now here inside of this setup here is I want to show you the so-named render stats. So I take this ramp here, and what I want to do is I want, for example, in the rendering process, that this ramp is not visible to the camera anymore, but it still has an effect on the rest of the scene. To do that, we can go here to the object properties, and there's here a submenu with the name visibility, and if you open this up, you see some things which you know here from this list. And here we have show in renderer, show in viewport. And if you then really want to tell Cycles as a renderer what he sees and where the object is visible, you go into the ray visibility, open this up, and now you see a whole list here. So what I now tell the system is that I say I don't want to have camera rays hitting this thing. The indirect stuff like diffuse, glossy, everything is there, but not the camera ray. Let's render this again, and yeah, we render the single layer. We see the result. And now you see this object here is not visible, but if you see here on the floor, you see the shadow is still there. So this is also a way of working here if you need something like that. So that's enough for today. I hope you understand this system a little bit more. If you have questions about that, write this in the comments. If you like this kind of tutorials, please subscribe, give me a thumbs up. And in the next tutorial, I will talk with you about all these passes here. So we talk about the light passes and also the data passes of the Cycles renderer to complete the whole idea of a multipassing and AOV system inside of Blender. My name is Helge from pixeltrain. See you next time.